My stepdaughter forgot to hang up after we spoke. Then I heard her tell her friends, "What a weak man. He is always playing Mr. Nice Man, but doesn't know his wife is still having an affair with my dad." I quietly hung up, but what happened next was rather unexpected. I will tell you everything. First, let me quickly thank you for your continuous support. This means a lot to us. If you enjoy the stories we share, kindly subscribe to this channel. It will be great if you can leave a comment on which city you are watching from. We might just give you a shout out in our next story. Today's special shout out goes to Bill Bannerman from Dublin. We are glad you enjoy our stories. Now let's go deeper into the story. I used to pride myself on being the kind of man people could count on. The one who didn't raise his voice, who kept his promises, who believed that patience and kindness could weather any storm. It wasn't that I was naive. I just genuinely believed that good intentions would eventually be recognized. My wife, Claire, often called me her rock, and I wore that as a badge of honor. I thought our blended family was proof that love could patch over old wounds. Her daughter, Emily, had been distant at first, but over the years I tried to bridge that gap with small gestures, helping with school projects, driving her to practices, making sure her tuition was paid without her ever having to worry. I told myself I was doing it for Claire, for us. In truth, I was doing it because I believed in the image of the family I thought we were building. It was an ordinary Wednesday afternoon when the moment came, the kind that doesn't announce itself with thunder, but changes the course of everything you thought you knew. I had called Emily to remind her about a rent payment for the apartment I covered while she was in college. She picked up quickly, her tone polite but clipped, like always. We exchanged a few brief words, me reminding her about a form she needed to submit, her giving me a quick, "Yeah, I'll take care of it." Nothing unusual. I said, "All right, I'll let you go." And then, I didn't hang up immediately. Maybe it was habit. Maybe I was distracted by an email on my computer, but I lingered for a few seconds before moving my thumb to the red button. That's when I heard it. Her voice, sharper, lighter, tinged with the mockery she never used with me directly. "What a weak man," she said, her words followed by the faint sound of someone laughing in the background. "He's always playing Mr. Nice Man, but doesn't even know his wife is still having an affair with my dad." The world seemed to slow around me. My hand froze over the phone. I felt a strange, hollow ache in my chest, like my heart had skipped not just a beat, but an entire rhythm. My first reaction wasn't anger. It was disbelief, the kind that makes your mind grasp at any alternative explanation. Maybe I'd misheard. Maybe she was talking about someone else. But her next sentence erased any doubt. "Mom's been careful, but she thinks he's too stupid to notice." Guess she's right. I stayed completely still, my breath shallow, as though any sound from me would give away that I was still there, listening. The laughter continued, a little muffled now, as if she had turned away from the phone. My mind was racing, trying to connect dots I'd never even realized existed. Claire and her ex-husband had always maintained a distant but civil relationship, supposedly for Emily's sake. I'd never questioned it. I thought our trust was solid, unshakable. But in that moment, Emily's careless cruelty cracked something open in me that I didn't think could ever be repaired. I quietly ended the call, my hand trembling, and stared at the screen for a long time afterward, watching my own reflection in the black glass, as if searching for the man who had just been described as weak. I didn't confront Claire that night. I didn't confront Emily. I didn't even pour myself a drink or take a long drive to think it over, though God knows I wanted to. Instead, I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and searched for the number of a lawyer I knew through a former colleague. I told him I needed to speak privately, that it was urgent but discreet. My voice was calm, eerily calm. Inside, I felt something shifting, not rage, not grief, but a cold, precise determination. I'd been blindsided, but I would not be blindsided again. When we hung up, he gave me the number of a private investigator, a man whose name sounded like it belonged in a hard-boiled detective novel. I saved it without hesitation. The next morning, I called the investigator. I didn't tell him everything, just enough to make my suspicions clear. He asked for details, names, schedules, photographs. I gave him everything he needed, my voice steady even though my hands itched to clench into fists. There was something strangely empowering about taking action without announcing it. For years, I'd been the man who forgave too easily, who brushed off small hurts for the sake of keeping the peace. But now, I realized, peace had been a facade, and I was ready to tear it down brick by brick. The investigator promised updates within a week. I thanked him and ended the call, already rehearsing the neutral tone I would use when speaking to Claire that evening, as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. For the next several days, I played my role to perfection. I smiled when she came home, asked about her day, offered to pick up groceries. We sat together on the couch and watched shows I wasn't paying attention to, my mind cataloging every glance she made at her phone, every text she replied to just a little too quickly. I wasn't paranoid, not anymore. I was gathering data, the way a chess player studies the board before the decisive move. There was a strange clarity to it, a focus I hadn't felt in years. I didn't see myself as a victim, not yet. I saw myself as a man quietly reclaiming control of his own life. On the 7th day, the investigator called. He didn't sound surprised when he told me what he'd found. Photos, time-stamped, of Claire meeting her ex-husband at a hotel. Credit card receipts for dinners I'd never been invited to. Text message transcripts so explicit I felt my stomach turn just reading them. I listened without interruption, my eyes fixed on the grain of the wooden desk in my office. By the time he finished, I already knew what I was going to do. This wasn't a decision to be delayed or discussed. This was war, and I had the advantage of knowing the enemy didn't realize she'd already been caught. I hung up and leaned back in my chair, the evidence folder now sitting in my inbox like a loaded weapon. My mind wandered back to that phone call with Emily, the casual cruelty in her tone, the smug certainty that I was too blind to see the truth. I thought about the years I'd spent paying her tuition, covering her rent, making sure she never had to struggle the way I had when I was her age. And in return, she had handed me the truth in the most careless way possible, like dropping a match in dry grass. The irony wasn't lost on me. Her attempt to mock me had given me the very ammunition I needed to dismantle everything she and her mother thought they could hide. The days that followed felt like living in a strange, private theater where only I knew the script. Claire continued her routines as though nothing had shifted, greeting me with casual affection in the mornings, sending me text messages in the afternoons asking if we needed milk or eggs. I responded in kind, never letting a hint of my knowledge seep into my tone. It was almost fascinating to watch her operate, to see how effortlessly she wore the mask I now understood was a permanent part of her. Every glance at her phone, every moment she slipped into the other room to take a quick call, I logged away silently, like a detective pinning evidence to a board. I began to see patterns where before I had only seen coincidence, and it amazed me how blind I had been when I still believed in her. The private investigator's updates came in small, deliberate doses, as though he knew too much at once might overwhelm even the calmest client. He would send a photograph here, a receipt there, never rushing but always confirming what I already suspected. Claire and her ex-husband had a rhythm, a pattern to their meetings, hotels during the week, restaurants in a part of town she never mentioned, phone calls that began and ended in the same quiet hours of the day. Each piece of evidence was like a drop of acid on the fabric of my marriage, eating away at the illusions I had wrapped myself in for years. Yet, I felt no urge to confront her yet. Timing, I knew, was everything. I wanted the foundation of her lies fully exposed before I made my move. I found it strange how quickly my mindset had shifted. Only weeks before, I might have dismissed a late night as traffic or work running over. Now, I studied every word she spoke with a precision that bordered on surgical. I had become an observer in my own home, a man playing the part of the devoted husband while mentally cataloging every inconsistency. And in some strange way, I think I enjoyed the control. For once, I wasn't the one reacting to her. She was moving entirely unaware that the ground beneath her was softening, ready to give way. There was a certain satisfaction in knowing that the end would come not with a shouting match or slammed doors, but with a cold, undeniable truth she couldn't talk her way out of. Emily, for her part, remained blissfully oblivious to the role she had played in her mother's downfall. Our conversations were minimal, mostly transactional, questions about bills, occasional reminders about deadlines for her classes. She never mentioned our accidental call, and I never gave her reason to suspect I had heard it. I found it easier to keep my interactions with her mechanical, stripped of the warmth I once tried to cultivate. In some ways, her betrayal felt sharper than her mother's. Claire had deceived me for her own selfish reasons, but Emily had spoken with a cruelty that revealed what she truly thought of me. That sting didn't fade. It festered quietly alongside my plans. One evening, as Claire sat scrolling on her phone, I sat across from her pretending to read a book. I was watching her reflection in the darkened window behind her, the way her lips twitched into the faintest of smiles as she typed. I wondered if she was messaging him, arranging their next meeting. The investigator had already given me the date of their next rendezvous, a detail I kept tucked away like a loaded chamber. I asked her, casually, if she wanted to have dinner together that Friday. She hesitated, her eyes flicking up for just a moment before she said she had a work thing that night. I nodded, feigning disinterest, but inside I could almost feel the pieces locking into place. The most surreal part of that period was how normal everything appeared on the surface. We still went grocery shopping together, still made small talk over morning coffee, still discussed mundane details about bills and errands. But every word out of her mouth was now layered with subtext for me. When she said she had to stay late, I heard, "I'm meeting him." When she said she was tired, I thought, "From who you've been with." It wasn't paranoia. It was the slow, methodical accumulation of truths I could no longer ignore. And the more I gathered, the more I realized there would be no coming back from this. Even if she were to confess and beg forgiveness, I had crossed into a place where reconciliation wasn't possible. The investigator called again that Thursday, his voice carrying that same unshaken professionalism. "Everything's confirmed for tomorrow," he said. "I'll have photographs, timestamps, and I'll be close enough to catch them leaving together." I thanked him, my voice steady. When I hung up, I found myself staring at Claire across the room. She was laughing at something on her phone, her hair falling over her shoulder, and for a moment, I saw the woman I had fallen for years ago. It struck me then that my grief wasn't about losing her. It was about losing the man I used to be when I believed in her. That man was gone now, replaced by someone who understood that trust, once shattered, could never be rebuilt. That night, I lay awake while she slept beside me. Her breathing was even, her hand resting loosely on my arm, and I felt nothing but distance. I thought about all the nights I had been faithful without a second thought, all the mornings I had kissed her goodbye, believing we were building a life together. I realized that she had probably been carrying on this affair for far longer than I'd suspected, maybe even from the beginning. The thought should have broken me, but instead it steeled me further. I had made my decision. Tomorrow, I would let the final piece of the puzzle fall into place, and then the clock on our marriage would start its countdown. Friday came with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. I woke early, moving through the house as if every motion had purpose. Claire was still asleep when I left for work, her hair spread across the pillow, the same peaceful image I'd seen countless times before. But now, that peace meant nothing to me. It was just another mask. The private investigator sent me a brief text just after noon. "They're here. Same hotel. Room 214. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. His work was almost done, and mine was about to begin. The knowledge of where she was and what she was doing sat in my chest like a stone, not crushing me, but anchoring me to the plan I'd set in motion. By the time I returned home that evening, Claire was already there, moving around the kitchen as if it had been an ordinary day. She smiled when she saw me, asked about my afternoon, and kissed my cheek. I looked into her eyes and saw none of the guilt I expected. If anything, she seemed more relaxed than usual, as if her little excursion had left her lighter. I poured myself a drink and asked about her work thing. She launched into a vague explanation, mentioning a late meeting and catching up with a colleague. I nodded along, my face unreadable, knowing I would never hear the truth from her lips. That was fine. I didn't need her confession. I had the evidence. The lawyer and I had coordinated everything for Monday. I wanted the weekend to pass without warning, to keep her comfortably unaware until the moment the papers landed in her hands. On Monday morning, I kissed her goodbye before leaving for work, the same as always. I even sent her a text later in the day asking if she wanted to have dinner that night. At 3 o'clock, as she was likely thinking about what to cook, the process server knocked on our door. I imagined her confusion as she signed for the envelope, the way her brow would furrow when she saw my lawyer's name at the top. The papers were blunt and final: grounds for divorce, full documentation of her affair, and a clear statement that financial support for Emily would end immediately. When I got home, she was sitting at the kitchen table, the papers spread in front of her like an accusation. Her eyes were red, but there was no trace of tears on her cheeks, just that sharp, defensive look I'd seen in arguments past. "This is a mistake," she said the moment I walked in. "It's not what you think." Her voice had that frantic edge, the kind that tries to outrun the inevitable. I pulled out the folder from my briefcase and placed it on the table between us. "No," I said evenly. "It's exactly what I think." I slid the photographs toward her, each one time-stamped, each one undeniable. Her hands trembled as she flipped through them. At first, she tried to deny it, claiming they were old or taken out of context. But with each photo, each receipt, each message, her defenses cracked. "Please," she said finally, her voice softening into a plea. "It's not what it looks like." I was confused. We were having problems, and I made a mistake. I stared at her, and for the first time, I truly saw her, not as the woman I had married, but as the stranger she had become. "You made a choice," I corrected. "More than once. For years." The conversation didn't last much longer. I told her that I wanted her out by the end of the week, that her access to my bank accounts had already been cut, and that I would no longer be covering Emily's expenses. Her eyes widened at that, and for a moment, her concern for her daughter seemed to outweigh her concern for herself. "She's in college," she protested. "She can't afford." "That's not my problem anymore," I said flatly. "She's an adult, and I'm not her father." She made it very clear what she thinks of me. I could see the moment she realized I knew about the phone call. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. She didn't ask how I'd heard it. She knew. By Tuesday morning, I had arranged for movers to pack her things. She followed them around the house in a daze, occasionally trying to start a conversation with me, but I kept my responses short and cold. Emily showed up halfway through the day, her expression tight with anger. "You can't just throw us out," she snapped. I turned to her, feeling none of the hesitation I once would have. "I can, and I am. Your mother made her choices, and you were happy to mock me for not knowing. Well, now I know, and you both can go figure out the rest on your own." She muttered something under her breath as she left, but I didn't care enough to catch it. When the last box was loaded into the moving truck, I locked the door behind them and stood in the silence of my house. It was strange how quickly the space felt lighter without them, like removing a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. My phone buzzed with a message from my lawyer confirming the next steps. Claire tried calling twice that evening, but I let both calls go to voicemail. She left one message, her voice thick with desperation, saying she didn't want to lose everything, that she still loved me. I deleted it without listening to the end. Love had nothing to do with what she'd done. The next day, Emily called from an unfamiliar number. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "My dad can't pay my rent," she said bluntly. "I need help." Her tone carried none of the arrogance from that day on the phone with her friends, only entitlement. "Emily," I said, "I don't owe you anything. You and your mother made your feelings about me very clear. I suggest you talk to your real father about your rent." There was a pause, and then a sharp click as she hung up. I blocked the number immediately. I felt no guilt, only the quiet satisfaction of finally drawing a line they couldn't cross. By the end of that week, the first phase of my plan was complete. Claire was gone, Emily was out of my life, and the legal process was underway. I knew there would be more calls, more attempts to sway me, but I also knew that my resolve was unshakable now. The man they thought was too nice had been replaced by someone who understood that kindness without boundaries is just an invitation for people to walk all over you. And I was done being walked on. The silence in my house was not empty. It was liberating. Without Claire's hurried footsteps, Emily's abrupt comings and goings, or the constant hum of their voices filling the air, the rooms finally felt like mine again. I woke each morning without the tension of wondering where she was or who she was texting. My coffee tasted stronger, the air smelled cleaner, and even the light coming through the windows seemed sharper. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was living in someone else's life. I could hear my own thoughts without their constant noise drowning me out, and those thoughts kept telling me one thing: you did the right thing. Of course, peace at home didn't mean peace everywhere. The first wave of backlash came from her side of the family. Text messages from her sister accusing me of destroying Claire's life. Phone calls from an uncle I barely knew telling me I was being cruel. I answered none of them. Then came the more subtle attacks. Mutual acquaintances posting cryptic messages on social media about men who can't forgive or people who let pride ruin love. I scrolled past them with the same detachment I might feel watching a storm on the horizon. They could shout all they wanted from a distance. They didn't know the truth, and I had no obligation to educate them. My silence became my shield, and I wore it proudly. Claire, on the other hand, refused to stay silent. She called repeatedly from different numbers, each voicemail swinging wildly between anger and pleading. In one, she accused me of throwing away everything we'd built. In another, she sobbed and swore she'd end things with her ex if I just took her back. The strangest part was that none of it moved me, not even a flicker of sympathy. The woman who used to be able to talk me down from my worst moods couldn't even make me pause now. Every word she said sounded like an attempt to keep her comfort intact, not to repair the damage she'd caused. And I wasn't about to give her that comfort back. Emily's attempts were shorter, sharper. After the block number incident, she tried once more through email, sending me a brief, almost transactional message about her tuition payment being due. I replied with a single sentence: "Your education is now your responsibility." That was the last I heard from her. I sometimes wondered if she regretted that phone call, if she realized it had been the first domino in the chain that toppled her mother's life. But even if she did, I doubted she'd ever admit it. Not to me, not to herself. That was fine. I wasn't looking for remorse. I was looking for distance. The real challenge wasn't resisting their attempts to re-enter my life. It was dealing with the people who wanted to mediate. A couple of mutual friends reached out just to talk, claiming they weren't taking sides, but asking if I'd at least hear Claire out in person. I told them there was nothing to discuss, and when one persisted, I cut him off entirely. The truth was, I had no interest in a reunion, no curiosity about what she might say face to face. I already knew her words would be empty, just like every promise she'd made while betraying me. My decision was final, and anyone who didn't respect that was showing me they didn't respect me. One Saturday afternoon, about 2 weeks after she'd left, I ran into Claire at the grocery store. She was standing in the produce section, holding a bag of apples, when our eyes met. For a brief second, there was a flicker of the old familiarity, two people who had once shared a home, a bed, a life. But then she smiled, that small, practiced smile I now recognized as her way of disarming people. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly, stepping toward me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. I just said, "No, Claire, we don't have anything to talk about." Then I walked away, leaving her standing there with her apples and her regret. The fallout extended beyond personal relationships. I had to make some practical changes, too, closing joint accounts, changing passwords, removing her as a beneficiary from insurance policies. Each task felt like cutting one more thread from a tangled web. It was tedious at times, but also deeply satisfying. Every form I signed, every phone call I made to sever another tie, was a reminder that I was building a life that no longer had room for betrayal. And with each cut, I felt lighter, more in control of my own future than I had in years. There were moments when the old part of me, the Mr. Nice Guy she used to count on, would try to surface. Once or twice, I caught myself wondering if I'd been too harsh with Emily, if perhaps I should have offered her some temporary support until she found her footing. But then I'd remember the tone in her voice that day on the phone, the way she mocked me without a second thought, and the hesitation vanished. Helping her now wouldn't be kindness. it would be erasing the consequences of her own actions. And I wasn't in the business of rescuing people who wouldn't even acknowledge they'd pushed me into the fire. By the time a month had passed, the calls and messages had slowed. The gossip faded into the background, replaced by other scandals and distractions in the lives of people who had once been so invested in mine. My house had become a place of quiet comfort again. I'd taken up cooking for myself, something I hadn't done much of when Claire was around, and I started meeting friends I hadn't seen in years. These weren't mutual friends who'd been caught in the crossfire. They were people from my own past, ones who had known me long before the marriage, before the betrayal. Talking with them reminded me of who I was before I got tangled up in someone else's dysfunction. Cutting the cord wasn't just about removing Claire and Emily from my life. It was about reclaiming my identity. For too long, I had been defined by my role in their lives: provider, mediator, peacemaker. Without them, I was free to be something else entirely. I didn't know exactly what that would look like yet, but I knew it wouldn't involve tolerating lies or allowing myself to be diminished for someone else's convenience. That knowledge was enough to keep me moving forward, step by deliberate step, toward a life that belonged solely to me. It's strange how the clean break I thought I'd made still had echoes. Even after weeks of silence, I would occasionally spot Claire's car parked near places I frequented, or notice a familiar figure at the far end of a cafe, pretending not to look in my direction. She never approached, but the message was clear. She was testing the waters, seeing if time and space would soften my stance. It didn't. If anything, those small sightings reinforced my decision. I didn't want a life where I was always watching for shadows, wondering if someone was there to plead, manipulate, or reopen wounds I had worked to close. I'd spent enough time on a leash disguised as a marriage. Now, every day, without her felt like another link in that chain being ground to dust. The social ripples hadn't entirely died out, either. Even months later, I would hear through mutual acquaintances about Claire's attempts to tell her side of the story. From what I gathered, it was a selective truth. She admitted to mistakes, but painted me as cold, unforgiving, and unwilling to try again. I didn't care enough to correct her, because the people who mattered either already knew the truth or didn't need to. But the one detail that caught my attention was that her best friend, Rachel, had apparently cut contact with her after the divorce. The gossip claimed it was because Rachel didn't want to take sides, but I knew better. Rachel had been around enough to see things most people didn't. She was sharp, observant, and not easily swayed by excuses. I hadn't seen Rachel in nearly a year when we ran into each other at a small wine bar downtown. She was sitting alone at a corner table, reading on her phone, and for a moment I almost kept walking. But she noticed me first, smiled warmly, and waved me over. I hesitated, then crossed the room. Our greeting was casual, but there was an undercurrent there. A shared understanding that we had both been close to the same hurricane and had survived it in different ways. "You look lighter," she said, after we ordered drinks. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was the truest thing anyone had said to me in years. Our conversation flowed easily, like two people picking up a thread they'd never meant to drop. She told me she hadn't spoken to Claire since shortly after the split. "It got too messy," she admitted. And honestly, I couldn't pretend I didn't know what she was doing. I didn't want to be complicit in it. There was no judgment in her voice, only a quiet solidarity. I found myself telling her things I hadn't shared with anyone else. About the phone call from Emily, the weeks I'd spent pretending not to know, the exact moment I decided there would be no second chances. She listened without interrupting, her gaze steady, and for the first time, I felt like someone wasn't just hearing my story. They were understanding it. What surprised me most about that night wasn't the comfort of her company, but the absence of guilt. If you told me during the marriage that I would someday enjoy spending time with Claire's best friend, I would have imagined feeling disloyal, or at least uneasy. But sitting there with Rachel, I realized that loyalty was only owed where it had been honored in return. Claire had forfeited hers long ago, and Rachel owed her nothing now. What existed between us in that moment wasn't about revenge. It was about connection, the kind that's forged not by shared joy, but by surviving the same betrayal from different angles. We started meeting occasionally after that, coffee on weekends, lunch during the week if our schedules aligned. It wasn't romantic at first, though I'd be lying if I said I didn't notice her in ways I hadn't before. She had an easy laugh, the kind that felt genuine, not polished for effect. She asked thoughtful questions and actually listened to the answers, which was something I hadn't realized I'd been missing until it was in front of me again. More than anything, there was no hidden agenda. With Rachel, what you saw was what you got, and after years of deception, that kind of honesty felt almost like a luxury. The turning point came one rainy evening when we met for dinner at a quiet Italian place. We lingered over the meal, neither of us in a rush to leave. When the check came, she reached for it instinctively, and I stopped her with a laugh. "Let me," I said, but she shook her head. "No, you've been carrying too much for too long. Let someone take care of you for once." It wasn't the words themselves that caught me off guard. It was the way she said them, without pity, without making it feel like a debt. That was the moment I realized I wanted more than just her friendship. Over the next few months, what began as cautious companionship deepened into something neither of us had expected. There were no games, no second-guessing motives. When we finally crossed that invisible line into being more than friends, it felt natural, inevitable, like we had been moving toward it all along. I didn't compare her to Claire, because there was nothing to compare. She wasn't filling a void. She was building something new with me, brick by brick, on solid ground. And for the first time in a long while, I wasn't just surviving, I was living. The final break from my old life came the day I heard that Claire had found out about Rachel and me. A mutual acquaintance mentioned that she'd called it the ultimate betrayal and had gone on a tirade about loyalty. I almost laughed out loud at the irony. This was the same woman who had carried on an affair behind my back for years, who had taken my trust and used it as currency with someone else. The idea that she had any claim on the moral high ground was laughable, but I didn't respond, didn't send a message through anyone. The break was complete, and I had no interest in reopening even the smallest channel. By the time Rachel and I decided to make things official, I realized I wasn't looking backward anymore. The divorce, the betrayal, even the satisfaction of cutting them out, it had all shifted into the rearview mirror. What lay ahead was something I was building deliberately, with someone who valued truth over convenience. The final break hadn't just been with Claire and Emily. It had been with the version of myself who tolerated less than he deserved. And I had no intention of ever being that man again. Sometimes I think about how easily I could have missed that phone call. If I'd hung up just a second sooner, I might still be living the life I thought was real. A husband quietly holding his family together while his wife smiled at him over dinner, hiding her other life in the spaces between. The thought doesn't scare me anymore, but it does make me grateful for the accident that revealed the truth. It wasn't just a turning point, it was a rescue. That moment, painful as it was, freed me from a slow kind of suffocation I didn't even realize I was enduring. Now, when I wake in the morning, I don't feel the heaviness of suspicion or the weight of pretending. I open my eyes and know I am exactly where I'm meant to be. Life with Rachel isn't perfect, but it's honest. That's what matters most to me now. Honesty over comfort, truth over peacekeeping. We've had disagreements, sure, but none of them are dressed in the elaborate disguises I grew so used to with Claire. If something's wrong, Rachel says it. If she's upset, I know it. There's a freedom in that kind of openness, one that makes every day feel lighter. It's not about avoiding conflict. It's about knowing that when conflict comes, it's real and can be resolved without hidden knives. I used to think love was about holding on no matter what. Now I know it's about choosing someone who doesn't make you regret holding on. Every now and then, I still hear a piece of gossip about Claire or Emily. Usually secondhand, from someone who hasn't yet learned I'm not interested. I've heard that Emily had to take on a part-time job to cover her expenses, that Claire's relationship with her ex-husband didn't last long after the divorce. Maybe that's true, maybe it isn't. I don't ask, and I don't care enough to find out. Their lives aren't mine anymore, and keeping it that way is the best decision I've ever made. Cutting those ties wasn't just about punishing betrayal. It was about reclaiming control over my own peace. Some people still think I was harsh, that I could have forgiven her just once. Those are the people who measure love by how much you're willing to endure for it. I've lived that way, and I know where it leads, straight into resentment, bitterness, and a hollow version of yourself that stares back from the mirror. Forgiveness can be a gift, but it can also be a leash, and I'd worn that leash for too long. The day I took it off wasn't the day I lost my marriage. It was the day I got my freedom back. That's not something I'll ever apologize for. Rachel has never asked me to compare her to Claire, and I wouldn't even if she did. They don't exist on the same scale. With Rachel, there's no pretense, no keeping score of who's given more or sacrificed more. We build together. We plan trips without wondering what lies might be told to make them happen. We sit in the quiet without feeling the need to fill it with chatter to mask discomfort. She has taught me that companionship doesn't have to be complicated to be fulfilling. It just has to be real. And after everything, real is all I want. Looking back, the path from that overheard phone call to where I am now feels both long and sudden. Long, because the weeks of pretending, of gathering evidence, stretched on like an endless chess match. Sudden, because once I made my move, everything fell apart, and then, unexpectedly, fell into place. There were moments when I questioned if I was being too cold, too final. But every time I revisit those moments, I remember that the alternative was staying in a life built on deceit. And no matter how I turn it over in my mind, I always land in the same place. I chose the only option that allowed me to live with my head high. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that boundaries aren't walls, they're gates. You decide who comes in and who stays out. And if someone proves they can't be trusted inside, you close that gate for good. Claire and Emily were part of my life for years, and I won't pretend those years were all bad. But they crossed lines that can't be uncrossed, and in doing so, they lost the privilege of access to me. That's not cruelty, it's self-respect. And self-respect, once you find it, is worth guarding with everything you have. I know there will be people who look at my story and think it's about revenge. They'll focus on the fact that I married Claire's best friend and call it payback. But that's not the truth. The truth is simpler. I didn't choose Rachel to hurt Claire. I chose her because she makes me feel safe in ways I didn't realize I was missing. If someone else had been that person, it wouldn't have mattered who they were. The fact that it's Rachel is just one more twist in a story that started with betrayal and ended in something better than I ever imagined. The better ending isn't about the life I have now. It's about the man I've become to have it. I'm not the weak man Emily thought I was. I'm not the naive husband who believed patience could fix anything. I'm a man who learned the value of walking away when staying means losing yourself. And I know now that sometimes, the only way to build something lasting is to burn down what was never meant to stand in the first place. That's the truth I carry forward, and it's the truth that keeps me grounded in the life Rachel and I are building, step by step, on solid, honest ground. If you overheard someone you trusted tearing you down and exposing a betrayal you never saw coming, would you stay silent long enough to gather proof, or would you confront them right away? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if my story resonated with you, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe for more real-life stories where boundaries are tested and hard choices are made. See you soon in the next story.